Take a look with me at Ruth chapter 1, verses 15 through 18. It's the passage that we've heard already today. Now look at what is said here. Not only from Naomi, who obviously is urging them to go back, but look at what Ruth's response is. Now Orpah turns around and goes home. But Ruth just won't let go. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And when Naomi realized just how determined Ruth was, she didn't say anything else to her. She didn't urge her to go back anymore because she realized that Ruth wasn't going to be persuaded to go anywhere else but right by Naomi's side. So together they went back to Bethlehem with no guarantee of anything but each other. That's all they had. Now Ruth could have turned back. She could have stayed in her own country. But Ruth chose to live her life as a poor, foreign widow in a land where she would be viewed always as an outsider. Why? Why do such a thing? Now at this point in the story, we could even say that Ruth's faith was even greater than Abraham's, because both left their homes and their family, but Abraham was given promises from God that he could lean into for reassurance. Ruth wasn't given anything. She wasn't promised anything in this. Now that's a lot of faith. That's a lot of faith and love. So what do you think? Is true love a feeling or a decision? Is true love a feeling or a decision? Now, while Naomi and Ruth were living there in Bethlehem, they kept themselves alive by gleaning. Now, I invite you to write down these passages because they're very important in the life of early Israel, these two passages in Leviticus, on how property owners and people who had wealth were to deal with those who didn't have anything. Now, essentially, this law said that if you had land and if you had crops, you were to leave the edges of your crops untouched. Don't harvest the edges of your field. Leave those for the poor and for those who are in need. The belief that God had given you exactly what you needed to survive, and in turn, He's expected you to help those who didn't have anything. So this concept of gleaning is what kept Ruth and Naomi alive for their time in Bethlehem. And this story of Ruth isn't without a little bit of humor. In the second chapter, we're introduced to a new character in this story named Boaz. And the author says it just so happened that Ruth went out to glean in a field owned by a man named Boaz. And this gentleman named Boaz wasn't just any guy. He was related to Elimelech, Naomi's former husband. Now, for an early Jewish reader, this would have immediately raised a red flag as soon as this Boaz came into the scene, because of one very simple concept. The concept of the kinsman redeemer, or the family redeemer. In other words, there was a provision in the law for the people of Israel that if you as a woman were left without a husband, if your husband perished, then the nearest relative, the nearest male related to him, was to come and marry you and take you into his household. And if you had no sons to carry on your family name, he was to provide an heir so that the family line would not be lost, so that the name would not be left behind in history. Now, Boaz is introduced to us as a close relative of Naomi's former husband. Ta-da! Ta-da! We've got hope. Hope shines into this story. And we're told that Boaz noticed Ruth from the very beginning when she came to glean in his fields. And he took care of her when she came by. He told his workers to protect her. He even told his harvesters to leave grain laying around in the field, so instead of her having to work for it, she could just come by and pick up what they had left behind. He even invited her to eat with him and his servants and gave her plenty of food to take home to Naomi. You see, Boaz went so far above and beyond what would have been expected or customary of the time. All that he was really required or urged to do from the law was to leave a part of his crops for her to come by and harvest. But he does so much more than that. He gave Ruth protection and extra food, a place at his table to eat, compassion and respect. And as Ruth told Naomi everything that was going on, Naomi realized the possibilities that were growing between Ruth and Boaz. So Naomi came up with a plan. One very, very risky plan. Now Ruth was to clean herself up, put on her best clothes, put on some perfume, and go to Boaz as he was sleeping on the threshing floor. We have to understand, as the harvest season would end, these gentlemen, these landowners, would go to the threshing floor for a period of time so that their grain could be separated out, so the grain could be separated from the husk. And so they would spend weeks on end at the end of the harvest season threshing their wheat, threshing their grain. And they couldn't just leave the grain out there because robbers could come, animals could come and eat it. So these gentlemen would literally go out at the end of the harvest season and stay for weeks on end alone, threshing wheat and then protecting their crop. They would sleep and eat and drink there. So you can imagine that lots of inappropriate things would go on out on the threshing floor. Often we have records of prostitutes that would make quite a lot of money during that harvest season because they knew the men would be alone out there for weeks on end. So what Naomi is suggesting is that Ruth go out and meet Boaz at the threshing floor. This is a risky thing to do. She could have been rejected or at least misunderstood in her intentions. It could have ruined her reputation. Could have lost her best chance at a good future. This is a risky plan. And we see in Scripture that when Boaz finished eating and drinking, he was feeling pretty good. And he went to sleep by his grain. And there in the middle of the night, Ruth came and laid down at his feet. Now we have to understand, culturally speaking, what Ruth is asking for in this is it's almost as if Ruth is literally asking Boaz to marry her. This is huge, and it's radical, and it's countercultural, and it could have ended with her being put to death if Boaz had gotten angry or misunderstood her intentions. And when Boaz awoke in the middle of the night, you can imagine how startled he must have been to find somebody sleeping at his feet. And when he asked who she was, and when she identified herself as Ruth, he realized what Ruth was doing. And he realized what Ruth was asking of him. Ruth was asking for Boaz to redeem her in Naomi. But Boaz, being ever the gentleman and ever the man of the law, he realized that there was another family member, another kinsman redeemer who was more closely related to Naomi and Ruth than him. So he sent Ruth home before anyone could see her, and he set out at the start of the next day to meet the other family member and discuss this situation. And when he met with this other gentleman, the conversation that we're given in Scripture is very, very interesting. At first, Boaz told him about the land that Naomi was trying to sell, which sounded like a great investment to this guy. He was all about it. He said, great, yeah, I'll redeem them. But then Boaz reminded him that he would have to marry Ruth as well. That this gentleman would have to provide an heir to Naomi's estate and rescue them both from their poverty and their vulnerability. And the other man wanted the land, but he wanted nothing to do with anything else. The cost to redeem them was much too high for him. It would literally cause him to sacrifice so much that it would put his entire estate at risk. The cost was too high. So this other guy backed down. Boaz, however, was more than ready to fulfill that role of redeemer. The depth of the sacrifice required to redeem them was only equaled by the depth of his love for them. So back to our original question, is true love a feeling or a decision? What have you seen in this story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz? Because here's the truth. Love based only on feelings will ultimately falter and fail because feelings are fleeting. Notice I've underlined only in this. A love that's based only on feelings will ultimately falter and fail because feelings can be fleeting. Granted, God has given us emotions and feelings and personalities. These are God-given gifts that we must treasure and understand because they tell us about ourselves. They tell us about the things that we value and that we prioritize in our lives. But our love has to be grounded in something deeper than feelings, which can change or be altered by something as simple as eating a bad piece of meat or waking up on the wrong side of the bed. It's got to be grounded in something so much deeper than that.